The courtroom was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers or the distant murmur of spectators. The trial of Marcus Evans had begun, and Leah Carter, the defense attorney, stood before the judge, her mind racing through every possibility. She had been practicing law for years, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of this case. Marcus was a young black man accused of a violent crime, robbery and murder. The evidence was damning, or so it seemed. Witnesses had identified him at the scene, and the surveillance footage appeared to confirm it. The prosecution, led by Douglas Fields, had built a solid case, or so they thought. But Leah wasn't convinced. She had worked on many difficult cases before, but something about Marcus's situation felt different. The more she read through the file, the more questions she had. Was he really guilty? Or had he been caught in a system that was already stacked against him? From the moment Marcus had walked into her office, she could tell there was something off about his case. His eyes, tired and wary, didn't speak of a hardened criminal, but of someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He insisted he hadn't committed the crime, that he was coerced into the situation. But when she reviewed the evidence, it felt as though the odds were stacked against him. As the trial progressed, Leah found herself facing a more insidious challenge than the evidence. The judge, William Hartwell, had made it clear from the very beginning that he was not on their side. Hartwell was known for his conservative views and his harsh sentencing, particularly when it came to cases involving black defendants. His reputation as a man who didn't tolerate unnecessary delays or complications was well known, and it seemed he had already made up his mind about Marcus. Leah could feel the weight of the judge's gaze on her. Every word she spoke scrutinized with increasing disdain. She tried to remain calm, knowing that showing any sign of weakness could cost her. But it was hard to ignore the undercurrent of hostility that seemed to emanate from Hartwell. His eyes would narrow whenever she made a motion or objected to something, and there was a noticeable tension whenever she spoke. "Your Honor, I request that we review the evidence before proceeding further," Leah said, her voice steady, though she could feel the judge's piercing stare. Judge Hartwell didn't even look up from his papers as he spoke. "We've already reviewed the evidence, Ms. Carter. This trial is about as open and shut as they come. Let's not waste time." Leah bit back the urge to snap at him. She had been in enough courtrooms to know when a judge had already made up their mind, but this was different. This felt personal. As the trial continued, it became clearer that the judge was determined to keep the defense at bay. Every time Leah tried to present evidence or ask for more time, Hartwell would shut her down. His attitude toward Marcus was dismissive, almost as if he had already decided that a black man like Marcus was guilty without a second thought. The prosecution, led by Fields, seemed to revel in the judge's bias. Fields was sharp, ruthless, and very good at his job. He played the game well, knowing that with a judge like Hartwell, his case would be practically a walk in the park. As he presented his argument, he barely acknowledged Leah, confident that the outcome would favor him. "Your Honor," Fields said smoothly, "the evidence is overwhelming. The defendant was seen at the scene of the crime, and we have multiple witnesses placing him there. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the weapon used in the murder and the surveillance footage." Leah had heard it all before. It was the same argument over and over again, as if they were simply going through the motions. But she knew that the truth of Marcus's story didn't lie in the evidence. It lay in the gaps, in the parts of the case that didn't add up. "Objection, Your Honor," Leah interjected, her voice cutting through the prosecutor's speech. "There are inconsistencies in the surveillance footage that need to be examined more closely. We need more time to analyze the footage properly." The judge barely acknowledged her objection, instead looking directly at Fields and nodding as if in approval. "Overruled. The evidence is clear. Let's move on," Judge Hartwell snapped. Leah felt her frustration building, but she held her ground. She couldn't afford to lose her composure. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Marcus's life was in her hands, and the only thing standing in her way was a corrupt, prejudiced system that refused to let him have a fair trial. Days passed, and with each session, Leah found herself growing more and more frustrated. Every argument she made, every objection she raised, was quickly dismissed by Judge Hartwell. It became clear to her that the judge wasn't merely ruling impartially. He was actively working against her, against Marcus. The courtroom had become a battlefield. The prosecution, under Field's confident direction, kept pushing forward, hammering away at the flimsy evidence. The jury seemed to hang on every word, swayed by the judge's authoritative presence and the prosecutor's sharp rhetoric. Meanwhile, Leah felt like a lone wolf, fighting an uphill battle. After another long day of testimony, Leah returned to her office, the weight of the case pressing heavily on her shoulders. Marcus was sitting across from her, staring down at the table, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. She could tell he was holding on by a thread, barely able to withstand the pressure. "How's it going, Leah?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice hoarse. Leah exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "Not great, Marcus. Hartwell is making it almost impossible for me to defend you. It's like he's already made up his mind. Then what can we do?" Marcus's voice cracked. "I didn't do this. I swear I didn't." Leah looked at him, feeling a deep sympathy for the young man. There was something in his eyes that told her he was telling the truth. Marcus had been in and out of trouble before, but he had always been trying to stay clean. This robbery, it didn't feel right. It didn't match the story Marcus had told her. She took a deep breath. "I'm going to dig deeper. I don't trust Hartwell, and I don't think this is just about you and your case. I think there's more going on here, something we're not seeing." Later that evening, Leah made her way to the courthouse library. She was on a mission. She started researching Judge William Hartwell's career, his past cases, any inconsistencies she could find. It didn't take long before she stumbled upon something that made her stop cold. In a dusty old file from a previous trial, Leah found references to Hartwell's connection with a prominent local crime family, the Morellis. The name had been mentioned in several cases that Hartwell had presided over. She knew the Morelli family. They had been notorious for their criminal activities, from drug dealing to extortion. But there was something even more disturbing about this discovery. The Morellis weren't just criminals. They were untouchable. The more Leah dug, the more she found. Hartwell had been involved in at least 3 cases where high-ranking members of the Morelli family had been acquitted or given minimal sentences. The judge had been known to rule in their favor, despite overwhelming evidence. Leah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she put the pieces together. Was Hartwell using his position to protect the Morellis? She continued her research, digging deeper into the Morelli family's connections to the legal system. She uncovered old news articles about the family's influence, and it became increasingly clear that the Morellis had their hands in many parts of the city: law enforcement, politics, and now the courts. Hartwell wasn't just a biased judge. He was part of a much larger, dangerous network. Leah couldn't believe what she was uncovering. This wasn't just a case of a prejudiced judge. It was systemic corruption that went all the way to the top. But how could she prove it? How could she get anyone to believe her when the judge's ties to the Morellis were so carefully hidden? With the discovery weighing heavily on her mind, Leah knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. If she was going to expose Hartwell, she needed more than just suspicions and circumstantial evidence. She needed something concrete, something that could force the court to take action. Leah spent the next few days investigating Hartwell's past in secret. She reached out to former clerks who had worked under him, hoping someone would be willing to talk. Most were too scared to speak, but after persistent effort, one former clerk, Carla, agreed to meet with her. Carla was an older woman who had worked under Hartwell for several years before retiring. She was nervous, glancing around the coffee shop where they met, making sure no one was watching. "You've got to be careful, Miss Carter," she whispered. "You're digging into something dangerous." Leah leaned in, her voice urgent. "I need to know what you know about Judge Hartwell and the Morellis. There's something off about this case, and I think he's involved in something much bigger." Carla hesitated before nodding. "I knew something wasn't right when I worked there. There were times when Hartwell would get these private calls, usually in the middle of the night. I'd see him leaving the courthouse looking different. He had these meetings with people connected to the Morelli family. At least that's who I thought they were. They'd walk out of his office looking satisfied, like they had just made a deal." Leah's heart raced. This was it, the confirmation she needed. "Do you have any proof? Anything that could help me expose him?" Carla shook her head. "I never saw anything concrete, but I always suspected he was on their payroll. They'd be in his office all the time, and nothing ever came of it. It's like the trials were just a formality for them. But he'd never have let me get close enough to gather any real evidence. Leah felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she didn't let it show. Thank you, Carla. You've given me more than enough to go on. Back in the courtroom, Leah had her work cut out for her. The trial was nearing its end, and if she didn't make her move soon, Marcus would be convicted, and she would have lost everything. Leah spent every waking moment preparing her strategy. She knew that without solid evidence, she couldn't accuse Judge Hartwell directly. But what she could do was cast doubt on his impartiality, create enough of a disruption to make the jury and the public question his credibility. With the closing arguments coming up, Leah prepared to present her findings. She had uncovered a private meeting between Hartwell and a key member of the Morelli family, recorded on a hidden camera by a source she had managed to contact. The footage was grainy, but it was undeniable. The judge was discussing the outcome of the case and how he was going to ensure a guilty verdict, regardless of the evidence. On the day of the closing arguments, Leah stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what she had to do. "Your Honor," Leah said, her voice steady as she addressed Judge Hartwell. "Before we proceed, I must present a piece of evidence that calls into question the integrity of this trial." She turned to the court clerk and nodded. The clerk placed the footage on the screen. The room fell silent as the grainy video played. The image was blurry, but it showed Hartwell in a private meeting with someone Leah recognized as a Morelli associate discussing the case. The prosecutor, Fields, immediately objected. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant and inadmissible." Leah stood her ground. "I respectfully disagree. This footage shows a clear conflict of interest and raises serious concerns about the judge's impartiality. I ask that you recuse yourself from this case immediately." The room erupted into chaos. The jury was stunned, and even the judge looked taken aback. Hartwell's face turned red, his eyes darting toward the prosecution, then to Leah, as if trying to regain control of the situation. Leah's gamble had worked. Now, all she needed was for the jury to see what she had uncovered, the truth. This is the continuation of the story, diving deeper into Leah's investigation and the explosive revelation of corruption in the courtroom. The courtroom buzzed with a tense, electric energy. No one knew how to react. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The video had played out on the screen, and Leah could see the shock on the faces of the jurors. They had just witnessed a private meeting between Judge Hartwell and a known associate of the Morelli family, and the implications were immediate. "Your Honor," Leah began, her voice firm but calm, "this footage is proof that this trial has been compromised. Judge Hartwell is not impartial. He is involved in a larger web of corruption, and it has directly affected the fairness of this case." Judge Hartwell's face twisted in anger, his eyes burning with fury. For a moment, it seemed as though he might strike back, perhaps even throw Leah out of the courtroom for daring to challenge his authority. But he remained seated, breathing heavily, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. "I don't know what this is, Miss Carter," Hartwell said, his voice low and seething, "but I will not tolerate these baseless accusations in my courtroom. You will withdraw this evidence immediately." Leah didn't flinch. She had prepared for this moment. She knew Hartwell would deny it, try to cover up his actions, but it didn't matter. The seed had been planted, and now it was up to the jury to decide whether they would ignore the truth or confront it. "Your Honor," Leah said, her voice unwavering, "the jury deserves to hear the truth. I ask that you recuse yourself from this case immediately." The room was silent. The weight of Leah's words hung in the air. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, some skeptical, some intrigued, others anxious about the repercussions of what had just unfolded. Judge Hartwell's gaze flickered to the jury, and Leah could see the tension in his eyes. It was clear he was trying to regain control, trying to salvage his reputation. But the cracks were already showing. "Motion denied," Hartwell said with forced authority. "The trial will continue as scheduled." Leah's heart sank. It was as though he had already made up his mind to bury the evidence, to push past the truth. But Leah wasn't going to back down. She knew that exposing the corruption in this courtroom would take more than a single piece of evidence. It would take relentless persistence, and that's exactly what she was prepared to do. Your Honor, she pressed on, I am requesting a mistrial based on these findings. The integrity of this trial has been compromised, and I demand a fair hearing before any verdict is delivered. The judge's face reddened, but this time, Leah could see that he was losing his grip. The prosecutor, Fields, stood up, his face pale, clearly unnerved by the sudden turn of events. He hadn't expected Leah to uncover anything so explosive. Your Honor, Fields started, but his voice faltered. He looked at Hartwell for guidance, but the judge was too rattled to offer any reassurance. Leah saw her opening. She knew this was her chance to push him into a corner. This is not just about Marcus Evans, Your Honor. This is about the integrity of the entire legal system. You have a responsibility to uphold the law impartially. And right now, you've shown that you cannot. Judge Hartwell sat back, his jaw clenched. He was no longer the imposing figure he had once been. The power he had wielded in the courtroom had been eroded, and Leah could sense his desperation to regain control. But the jury was watching. Leah could feel their eyes on her, on Hartwell, and on Fields. She knew they had to be wondering, if the judge had been involved in something this corrupt, what did that mean for the case? What did that mean for their duty as jurors? The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. The jury was sent to deliberate, and the spectators were hushed, waiting for a verdict that felt more uncertain than ever. For Leah, the waiting was agonizing. She had done everything she could, exposed the corruption, and shaken the foundation of the trial, but now it was out of her hands. Marcus sat beside her, his face unreadable. He had been through so much already, and now his fate was hanging in the balance. Leah could see the strain in his eyes, the fear that this would all be for nothing. He had put his trust in her, and she couldn't bear the thought of failing him. I'm sorry, Marcus, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I did everything I could. He nodded but didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They both knew how fragile the justice system could be, especially when it was so deeply compromised. The door to the courtroom opened, and the jury returned, their faces grim. The foreman stepped forward and cleared his throat. Leah held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. We, the jury, find the defendant. The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Guilty, the foreman said at last. Leah's heart sank. The verdict was final, and Marcus was headed to prison. She couldn't believe it. All of her efforts, all of her work had led to this crushing moment. But she didn't give up. She couldn't. She had known all along that there was more at play here than just this trial. There was a system of corruption that had to be exposed, no matter what it took. Your Honor, Leah said, standing up with resolve, I'm requesting an immediate appeal. We will fight this, and we will not stop until justice is done. Marcus's eyes met hers, and for the first time, a flicker of hope passed across his face. He didn't speak, but the quiet gratitude in his gaze was all the confirmation Leah needed. She had failed to save him today, but she would not stop fighting. Not now, not ever. Leah spent the next few weeks working tirelessly to build a case for an appeal. She reached out to investigative journalists, private investigators, and former colleagues, hoping to uncover more evidence of Judge Hartwell's ties to the Morelli family. The more she dug, the more disturbing details emerged about Hartwell's corrupt dealings. But she knew that it wouldn't be enough to simply expose the judge. It had to be enough to overturn Marcus's conviction. The fight was far from over, and Leah wasn't about to let it go. The case had become bigger than just one defendant. It was a battle against a corrupt system, one that she would take to the highest courts if necessary. As the days passed, Leah grew more determined. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she also knew that exposing Hartwell's corruption was the first step toward true justice. Marcus's case had shown her the cracks in the system, the injustices that so many had suffered in silence, and she would do everything in her power to make sure they were heard. The journey was just beginning, and no matter the cost, Leah was ready for the fight. This concludes the next part of Broken Oath. The story continues to build momentum, and now Leah is determined to expose the corruption while fighting for Marcus's justice. Would you like me to continue further, expand any part, or adjust anything? Let me know your preferences. Leah's office was filled with files, stacks of papers, evidence, and witness testimonies. She had become obsessed with unraveling the tangled web of corruption that had led to Marcus's conviction. She knew the risks. Taking on Judge Hartwell, a man with deep ties to the Morelli family, could cost her career, her reputation, and her freedom. But she had already crossed that line. There was no turning back. Her first move was to contact an investigative journalist named Derek West. He was known for taking on high-profile corruption cases, often at great personal risk. When Leah called him, she could hear the skepticism in his voice. But after explaining her case, Derek agreed to meet. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, Leah anxiously stirring her coffee as Derek leaned back, studying her with intense curiosity. "Why do you want to take down a judge?" he asked bluntly, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. Leah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "It's not just about him. It's about the entire system. Marcus Evans is innocent, and Judge Hartwell, he's a pawn in a much larger game. The Morellis are involved in everything. Drugs, money laundering, and now I've discovered they've been influencing judicial decisions for years." Derek's expression softened slightly. "All right, I'll bite. But you're going to need more than just a gut feeling. Hartwell is a respected judge. Going after him without rock-solid proof would be career suicide for you. And it'll be dangerous." Leah met his gaze. "I know the stakes, but Marcus deserves a chance, and I won't stop until he gets it." Derek nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Then I'll help. But be prepared. It's not going to be easy." Over the next few days, Leah and Derek worked around the clock. They followed every lead, interviewed former colleagues of Judge Hartwell, and reviewed decades-old case files. Slowly, the picture became clearer. Hartwell's involvement with the Morelli family was deeper than anyone had imagined. But it wasn't just the family's influence on his rulings. It was his connections to other powerful figures within the city's elite that made him untouchable. As Leah dug deeper, she uncovered evidence that Judge Hartwell had been involved in a covert operation to cover up a series of brutal murders linked to the Morelli family. It was becoming more and more apparent that Hartwell wasn't just a judge with biases. He was an active participant in a larger criminal network. Leah could feel the weight of the case on her shoulders. She was fighting not just for Marcus, but for something bigger, a chance to expose the flaws in the system, to show the world that the truth could still be uncovered, no matter how deeply buried it was. As Leah and Derek continued to gather evidence, the threats began to escalate. It started with anonymous phone calls, late at night, warning Leah to back off. Then, one evening, as she left her office, she noticed her car had been tampered with. The tires were slashed and the windshield was cracked. The message was clear: stop digging. But Leah refused to be intimidated. She knew this was just the beginning. As she walked into her office one morning, Derek was waiting for her, a grim look on his face. He handed her a folder, the contents sending a chill down her spine. "Look at this," he said. "It's not just Hartwell. The Morellis have their hands in everything: media, law enforcement, politics. You've uncovered something much bigger than you thought." Leah opened the folder and stared at the photos inside. They were taken from surveillance footage. In one of the images, Judge Hartwell was seen leaving a private meeting with the head of the Morelli family, Dominic Morelli himself. In another, Hartwell was seen talking to a police officer who had been involved in covering up a murder case that had mysteriously disappeared from the records. It was all starting to make sense. The corrupt system wasn't just about Hartwell. It was about a network of people working together to protect the Morellis, to keep them above the law. Leah clenched her fists. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. If they could expose this network, they could not only clear Marcus's name, but they could bring down the Morellis once and for all. But the risk was enormous. They had to be careful. One wrong move, and the entire case could be compromised. Leah knew the time had come to go public. The pressure was mounting, and she couldn't afford to wait any longer. She had all the evidence she needed to prove that Judge Hartwell had been compromised by the Morellis. But to make it stick, she had to go straight to the media. She arranged a meeting with a trusted news anchor, Rachel Stevens, who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Rachel had been following the case from the start, but she had no idea how deep the story actually ran. Leah laid it all out for her. The connections between Hartwell, the Morellis, and the cover-up. Rachel was shocked, but understood the gravity of what Leah was proposing. She agreed to take the story to the news, but not without hesitation. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel asked. "If we go public with this, there's no turning back. You're going to make enemies, and they're powerful. You could ruin your career, or worse." Leah's face was set in determination. "I'm not worried about my career. I'm worried about justice. If we don't expose this now, how many other innocent people will suffer?" Rachel gave a small nod, a sign of her agreement. "All right, we'll do it your way. But be ready. Once this goes live, there's no going back." The next few days were a blur. The story broke in the media, and the public response was immediate. News outlets everywhere began covering the scandal. Judge Hartwell's involvement with the Morellis, the cover-up of the murders, and the massive corruption that had been allowed to fester for years. The pressure on the judicial system was immense, and suddenly, everything was under a microscope. Leah watched the coverage unfold, her heart pounding. She knew the Morellis would fight back. They wouldn't let this slide so easily. But now, the fight had escalated, and Leah was prepared for whatever came next. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. The media storm was just the beginning. With the public now aware of the corruption, Leah and Marcus were thrust into the center of a battle that would determine the future of the case. The Morellis weren't going to give up easily, and neither was Judge Hartwell. As the courtroom reconvened, Leah stood before the judge, her face a picture of calm determination. She had everything she needed. The evidence was overwhelming, the public outcry was deafening, and now, the moment had arrived to force the system to confront its own flaws. This is it, Leah thought. This is where it all changes.